There's an annual carnival in Maldon, Essex, but 1991 was a very special year. This time, there was to be more than the usual bunting and procession. For August 1991 marked the 1000th anniversary, the millennium, of a fierce battle of the Dark Ages that was fought just outside the town. A 1,000 years ago, in August AD 991, the Saxon farmers of Essex were looking forward to the harvest that would see them through the winter. There was work to be done in the fields. And then came the bad news, that Viking pirates from across the North Sea were raiding again. The Saxons' worst fears were realized. The Vikings sailed up the Blackwater estuary and landed on Northey Island, where they could clearly be seen from the town. The original Battle of Maldon was fought opposite Northey Island, and a new battle was to be fought on the self-same spot in August 1991 to mark the millennium of the historical event. A stadium was built for the occasion, down by the Blackwater estuary. And there were celebrations in the town, too. The museum in the old Moot Hall of the Corporation of Maldon, with its fine spiral stairs in brick, complete with inbuilt handrail, displayed a specially commissioned embroidery, telling the story of the town from the battle up to the present day. The story ends with late 20th century motorways and takes us back in time through prosperous Victorian days when the railways transformed the life of the town before the coming of the car. The sailing barges, for which Maldon is still famous, were the mainstay of commercial life before the railways. The medieval spiral stairway is itself commemorated along with the corporation of the town. The borough arms show 3 Plantagenet lions, and the man of war the town contributed to the defence of the realm after its charter was granted in 1171 by King Henry II. The first 2 panels of the embroidery, on which 100 local people worked under a professional embroiderist, tell the story of the Battle of Maldon, from the arrival of the Viking ships in the estuary of the Blackwater, known in Saxon times as the River Panta. We still know a great deal about the battle because an Anglo-Saxon poem, written shortly after the event, has come down to us. The Viking shallow draft ships made unbeatable ocean-going landing craft, ideal for coastal attacks on the flatlands of East Anglia. So they were able to land on Northey Island, connected to the mainland only at low tide by a narrow causeway. They were met by a local Saxon militia and a refusal to pay the Danegeld to bribe them to go away and attack someone else. The Saxons were led by Brythnoth, Essex's chief landowner and ealdorman, no longer young, but an experienced commander. He was opposed by the Viking leader, thought to have been Olaf Tryggvason, in command of seasoned professional fighters. The fight was a fierce one, once battle was engaged, with both sides giving as good as they got. There were desertions on the Saxon side, and in the end they were beaten, and Brythnoth lost his life and his head to the pirates. His body was carried off the battlefield by monks, who buried him in Ely Cathedral in the Fens, where he had held lands. His widow is said to have laboured long at Ely on a tapestry commemorating his life, but that was long since lost. Now Maldon has a new embroidery to celebrate its history. The town entered into the spirit of the millennium celebrations. The co-op dressed a window with figures of Brythnoth and the horse that was to play a decisive part in the fortunes of war as the battle progressed. Quotations from the Anglo-Saxon poem about the battle bring the detailed events of 1,000 years ago to life. In the grounds of St. Peter's Church, the Horticultural Society have recreated a garden of that time, stocked only with the plants you could have found growing in a monastery garden then, many of them medicinal or sweetly perfumed. There were strongly coloured and strongly scented flowers in those days too, even if many of the products of 1,000 more years of cultivation were missing. The medieval garden will be a permanent memorial of the millennium celebrations. One of the landmark churches of Maldon is St. Mary's, down by the riverside, where the famous sailing barges are tied up. And just up the hill, Maldon means the crossroads on the hill in Anglo-Saxon, St. Mary's stands on the site of a Saxon church. As part of the millennium celebrations, a new stained glass window has been commissioned for St. Mary's. It is inspired by the dying prayer of Brythnoth, recorded in the Anglo-Saxon poem, giving thanks for the joys of this life. We shall hear his words during the battle. From St. Mary's, the estuary and Northey Island can easily be seen, the precise site of the Battle of Maldon, and perhaps not too changed over these 1,000 years. The Vikings had been reported in the summer of 991, raiding first at Folkestone, then at Sandwich, and then heading north for the East Anglian coastline. Where would they strike next? The battle reenactment for the Maldon millennium began with the Viking longships, scaled down a little from the originals, playing out the pirates' attack on the various English towns, which preceded their arrival on Northey Island. When the Vikings were able to land, they proceeded to burn and loot the towns. Many of the local people were killed, but some were dragged off by the pirates for a life of slavery, to be taken back to the Vikings' headquarters in Scandinavia and North Germany, and then sold on as slaves, perhaps as far as Baghdad in the end. The Viking ships that landed on Northey Island were probably carrying captive English people, East Anglians among them, when Brythnoth faced them from Maldon. Ipswich bore the brunt of a Viking raid before the pirates turned south again and entered the Blackwater estuary to make themselves a base on Northey Island. The island is still connected to the bank of the estuary only by a narrow causeway, which can only be crossed at low tide. So long as the disembarked Vikings were restricted to the island, no real battle could be joined. The mudflats were uncrossable, even at low tide, and the causeway could be blocked by a few men of either side to stop the Vikings getting across to Maldon or the Saxons getting at them. Why Brythnoth agreed to let the Vikings across remains a mystery. Perhaps he thought a stand just had to be made against them here at Maldon. On August the 10th and 11th, 1991, in front of a brushwood mock-up of a Viking ship, the Battle of Maldon was reenacted by the Vikings, the Norse Film and Pageant Society, whose enthusiastic members flocked in from all over the country to join the people of Maldon in the millennium celebrations. There was general jollification with a specially brewed ale and a craft fair on the edge of the battleground with a mixture of new and more traditional attractions.
No, you would not while the parties come. Now be quiet.
It's like there's two different fabrics of flora mixed and also wine.
The display of falconry had an apt association with the battle itself. Brythnoth released a much-loved hawk from his hands into the nearby wood before he went forward into battle. Falconry brings with it a flavour of the Middle Ages, and the organisers of the Millennium Weekend were keen to leave their visitors with a feel for the Dark Age world in which the Battle of Maldon was fought. A Saxon village was recreated beside the battle stadium, with the houses and crafts of 1,000 years ago brought to life again. Those Saxon farmers were a settled Christian population who wanted to get on with their harvest when their Scandinavian cousins, still pagans, descended on them in search of loot or a payoff, or battle, if necessary. The Vikings might have been bought off with Danegeld this time, but Brythnoth must have made up his mind to fight them, rather than see them get away unscathed to raid other English towns. There was certainly wealth around in Anglo-Saxon England, and skilled craftsmen to make fine and costly ornaments, but those skills could be put to military use too. And the local militia raised among the Essex farmers were well equipped for warfare if it came to it. The battle reenactment began with a march past of the warriors from both sides. The Saxons led by their Earl Brythnoth, and the Vikings by the grim figure of Olaf Tryggvason. The members of the Norse Film and Pageant Society pride themselves on the authenticity of their costume and gear, and they have followed the narrative of the Anglo-Saxon records of the Battle of Maldon as closely as possible. The local Saxons would have benefited from reports of the pirates' progress from Folkestone to Ipswich, and their own fishing boats off the Essex coast would have kept a watch on the approaching raiders. So the reenactment involved a small Saxon fishing boat along with the Viking longships. Brythnoth arrived on the battlefield on horseback, but horses were to play no part in the fight. Brythnoth's hawk was released into the local woods well before hostilities began. Then the Saxon leader rode up and down the lines of his warriors to put courage into them for the fight ahead. Now Brythnoth dismounted and let his horse be led away behind the lines. It was to play no part in the fight until an unfortunate turn of events towards the end of the day. The hardened Viking warriors surely made a fearsome impact on the anxious Saxon defenders of Maldon, most of whom would have preferred to be back on their farms. Parleying across the water that divided Northey Island from the bank, the Vikings first tried to persuade the Saxons to pay them off without a fight. In return for the Danegeld, the pirates would sail away, but the Saxons would have none of it. According to the poem, Brythnoth delivered an uncompromising retort to the Vikings.
Etrina ord an eilna sword. Us shall ord and edge gisiman. Grim good plega. We. Gawal Ceylon.
Only by means of the causeway at low tide could the opposing forces get at each other, and the causeway was easy to defend. The Vikings made several attempts to come across, but they were always beaten off by a Saxon guard under Wulfstan at the end of the causeway. And it was now that Brythnoth made his fateful decision to let the Vikings off the island and have it out with them in a full-scale battle. The Vikings made the most of their chance to fight. But the Vikings, seasoned professionals as they were, against a hastily raised militia of farmers, didn't have things all their own way. The Saxons gave a good account of themselves, and the outcome of the battle was by no means a foregone conclusion. Brythnoth was not a young man, but he fought with valor against the Viking warriors who sought him out on the battlefield. He was wounded more than once, and eventually lost the use of his sword arm and fell, mortally injured, among his compatriots. As he lay dying, the Saxon leader exhorted his troops to fight on and commended his soul to heaven.
Ich jesangere. Theodowaldens. Ialdrathira ulna. Sijon hoorde jebat. Mujach milde metot. Meste zerve. That minum gaste godes geunne. That min soul to the Sidian mote. En sin je welt. Theoden Engla. Mit Friese. Ferian.
Some of the Saxons had no stomach for the fight now and fled the battlefield. Godric deserted on Brythnoth's horse and fatally demoralized many of the remaining warriors who thought that Brythnoth himself was fleeing. But there were plenty of Saxons who would not quit and determined to fight on to the bitter end with all hope gone, while the faint-hearted turned and ran. These stout-hearted Saxons rallied round the body of their dead leader, encouraging one another to stay and fight, from the noblest warriors to the humblest churls, as the poem tells us. Even at this stage, the Vikings, who had not had an easy time of it, for all that they had killed the Saxons' leader, were willing to come to terms. Olaf Tryggvason made a final offer to stop the fight and let the remaining Saxons go, if only they would pay the pirates off. But, as before, the Saxons would not make terms. Those left on the field vowed to fight to the death. An old warrior, shaking his ash-wood spear, exhorted them with these words.
Jag skall de hardra, heorta, de kenra, mål skall de mara, de ora mejan liktad. Ichom frådfjores, fram ichne wille, Agit me behalva minom slavorde, beswa leovan, men ligentenki.
The end was inevitable. The Saxons were all cut down, and Brythnoth's head was carried away by the Vikings. But for all their victory, they too were badly mauled, with scarcely enough oarsmen left to man their boats and sail away from Northey Island, without the Danegeld. The August weekend celebrations of the Maldon millennium ended with a torchlight procession around the battlefield, echoing the mourning rites of 1,000 years ago, when the Saxons gave Christian burial to their dead and grieved for their leader, and the Vikings observed their own pagan rituals of death. The giant brushwood representation of a Viking ship that had formed the backdrop to the battle reenactment was torched at the climax of the procession to burn away for hours at the close of the 1000th anniversary of the Battle of Maldon.